In the quiet town of Forchtenberg, Germany, a girl was born on May 9, 1921. Her name, Sophie Magdalena Scholl. The world around her was fragile, still healing from the wounds of a war that had shattered nations. Streets lined with cobblestones echoed with the laughter of children, the clatter of carts, and the faint toll of church bells. Life seemed ordinary, but beneath this calm, the winds of change were stirring. Sophie's home was modest, yet filled with warmth, intellect, and principle. Her father, Robert Scholl, was a man of integrity, a voice of reason in a society increasingly consumed by fear and propaganda. Her mother, Magdalena, nurtured kindness, empathy, and a sense of moral responsibility. From her earliest days, Sophie absorbed lessons that would shape her character. Courage is measured not by power, but by principle. Silence in the face of injustice is a form of complicity. The Germany Sophie entered as a child was fragile and fractured. Hyperinflation devoured savings, families struggled to survive, and extremist ideologies began to take root. Sophie may have been young, but she noticed the subtle signs: neighbors' hushed conversations, the fear in their eyes, the tension lingering like mist in the streets. She learned early that the world could be cruel, and that one's conscience would often be the only guide. Yet Sophie's childhood was not solely defined by fear. She loved the arts, music, painting, and especially literature. Books became her sanctuary, her companions during quiet evenings when the world outside seemed uncertain. She devoured poetry and moral fables, learning to question, to reflect, to seek truth. Even as a young girl, her mind sought clarity in a world clouded by confusion. Her father's guidance was profound. Robert Scholl often spoke about justice, responsibility, and the courage to stand for what is right, even when standing alone. These were not abstract lessons for Sophie. They were living principles. She observed how people compromised, how fear silenced many, and she quietly vowed to trust her own conscience. As Sophie grew, she saw the rise of the Hitler Youth. Children her age, friends, and classmates were drawn in by promises of pride, unity, and purpose. Sophie watched from the edges, noticing contradictions. She heard speeches glorifying obedience, yet saw discrimination and cruelty quietly enforced. A seed of defiance began to take root, a subtle understanding that morality could not be sacrificed for fear, loyalty, or popularity. Her brother, Hans Scholl, played a pivotal role in shaping her moral compass. 2 years older, fiercely intelligent, and principled, Hans engaged Sophie in late-night discussions about ethics, justice, and the responsibility of conscience. They debated, questioned, and imagined a world where courage mattered more than comfort. These conversations were formative, laying the groundwork for decisions that would one day echo far beyond their family home. By her teenage years, Sophie's awareness of injustice had sharpened. She noticed Jewish families being marginalized, neighbors disappearing, and the subtle enforcement of conformity in schools. She observed fear and complicity in others, and realized that courage required action, no matter the personal cost. Sophie began to understand the price of silence and the power of individual conscience. Sophie did not isolate herself. She sought friendships with those who questioned, debated, and reflected. Together, they shared literature, philosophy, and moral discourse, acts of quiet rebellion in a society increasingly intolerant of independent thought. Every whispered conversation, every carefully considered action, strengthened her resolve. Sophie Scholl was preparing herself for a time when the world would demand more than observation, more than reflection. Her parents' influence remained constant. Robert Scholl's civic courage and refusal to compromise his principles provided a living example of integrity. Magdalena Scholl's guidance emphasized empathy, compassion, and protection of the vulnerable. Sophie internalized these lessons, her conscience sharpened, her courage quietly building, layer by layer, moment by moment. By the late 1930s, Hitler's rise had transformed Germany. Civil liberties vanished, schools enforced ideological conformity, and propaganda saturated every corner of life. Sophie observed the tightening grip of the regime, yet her internal moral compass remained unbroken. She saw friends swept into blind obedience, families quietly silenced, and a society becoming numb to injustice. But Sophie's resolve strengthened. She would not let fear dictate her actions. By the time she entered the University of Munich, Sophie Scholl was not yet a public figure, not yet a revolutionary. But the principles that would define her were already ingrained. She chose to study biology and philosophy, subjects that would allow her to understand human nature, ethics, and the moral responsibilities of individuals. The seeds of rebellion, quietly planted during her childhood and adolescence, were now ready to take root in a broader, more dangerous world. Every quiet reflection, every careful observation, every ethical question Sophie asked herself was a rehearsal, preparing her for a confrontation that would demand courage unlike anything she had yet experienced. Sophie Scholl, the girl from a modest German town, was quietly becoming a force of conscience. And though she could not know it yet, her courage would one day defy one of the most terrifying regimes in history, echoing far beyond her own lifetime. This is the story of Sophie Scholl, the girl who defied Hitler, not with weapons, not with armies, but with words, courage, and unwavering conscience. The University of Munich, a place of learning, of ideas, of possibilities. For many, it was simply another chapter in life. For Sophie Scholl, it would become the stage upon which courage would meet conscience. Stepping into the grand lecture halls, Sophie felt the weight of history pressing against every stone wall. The air was filled with the hushed whispers of students discussing philosophy, ethics, and politics. She listened, observed, and reflected, always aware of the undercurrent of fear, always noticing those who had surrendered their voice to propaganda. It was here that Sophie reconnected with her brother Hans, who shared her moral clarity and growing unease with the world around them. Together, they began conversations that would shape their future, discussing justice, morality, and the courage required to oppose evil. These discussions were no longer theoretical. They were preparation, a rehearsal for the real moral choices that would soon confront them. Through her studies in philosophy and biology, Sophie developed a keen understanding of human behavior, ethics, and the consequences of blind obedience. She observed how authority could corrupt, how fear could silence, and how words could influence minds. These lessons were not abstract. They were urgent, real, and necessary for the decisions she would soon face. In quiet moments between lectures, Sophie walked the streets of Munich, observing a city under the tightening grip of Nazi ideology. Propaganda posters adorned every corner, glorifying obedience, uniformity, and submission. Yet in the alleys, in the shadows, there were signs of resistance, whispers, small acts of defiance, courage hidden in plain sight. Sophie's heart recognized the bravery in these subtle gestures. She understood that courage often flourished in silence before it could shine in the open. It was in these streets and lecture halls that Sophie met like-minded peers, Christoph Probst, Alexander Schmorl, and other students who shared her moral clarity. Together, they began to envision a form of resistance, not through violence, but through conscience. The idea was simple yet dangerous. They would write, print, and distribute leaflets exposing the lies of the regime, calling citizens to reflect, to question, and to act morally. The White Rose, as they would later call themselves, was born in these quiet conversations. Their gatherings were clandestine, their plans meticulous. Every word had weight, every action carried risk. They understood that exposure meant death, yet the moral imperative outweighed fear. Sophie, Hans, Christoph, and Alexander became more than students. They became guardians of conscience, voices in a world increasingly silenced by terror. Sophie's role in the group was vital. Her clarity of thought, courage, and moral authority inspired others. She meticulously reviewed leaflets, contributed ideas, and risked her own safety in every act. Though young, she carried the weight of responsibility with remarkable composure. Her family's teachings, the unwavering guidance of her parents, the shared courage with Hans, were now fully manifest in her actions. The first leaflets were modest, yet powerful. Carefully printed, folded, and hidden, they spread throughout Munich, slipped under doors, left in public spaces, and handed discreetly to trusted friends. Each leaflet bore their signature ethos: the call to conscience, the plea for moral action, the courage to speak the truth. Sophie understood that words could be weapons stronger than any blade. Ideas could ignite resistance where guns could not. The group operated in secrecy, yet tension was constant. Every knock at the door, every officer's gaze, every whispered rumor could signal discovery. Sophie and her friends navigated this world with caution, balancing moral imperative against survival. Their courage was quiet, yet resolute, a storm beneath the calm surface of student life. Even within the university, Sophie observed fear and conformity in her peers. Many had surrendered their conscience for safety, repeating slogans without thought, parroting propaganda as if truth itself had been rewritten. Sophie felt a deep sadness for these students, but also a resolve. Moral courage is a choice, and she had already chosen. The White Rose meetings became more frequent, more daring. Sophie and her friends debated ideas, refined arguments, and planned distribution strategies. Each leaflet was carefully considered, every phrase deliberate. They knew that each action could mean death, yet they acted because inaction was a betrayal of conscience. Sophie's own writings reflected her inner turmoil and steadfast commitment. She often recorded her thoughts late at night, candlelight flickering across the pages. Her reflections revealed a young woman grappling with fear, morality, and the enormity of responsibility. Yet through it all, her courage remained unbroken, her resolve unwavering. By the end of 1942, Sophie and the White Rose had distributed their leaflets across Munich, slipping them under doors, leaving them in stairwells, and placing them where eyes might glimpse the truth. Each act, though small in scale, carried immense weight. Sophie understood that these leaflets were more than paper. They were a statement of conscience, a beacon of moral courage in a society drowning in fear. And so, the stage was set. Sophie Scholl, the young student with a mind sharp as a blade and a heart steadfast as stone, was ready to confront one of the most terrifying regimes the world had ever known, ready to risk her life for truth, morality, and the courage of conscience, ready to become the girl who defied Hitler and whose voice would echo through history. Winter had settled over Munich in late 1942, wrapping the city in a cold, unyielding silence. Snow dusted the streets, and the air carried a biting chill. Yet beneath the quiet surface, a different kind of heat was rising. The courage of a small group of students determined to speak the truth. Sophie Scholl, now fully aware of the moral abyss surrounding her, moved with deliberate purpose. Each step she took, each glance she cast, was measured. Danger lurked everywhere. The Nazi regime had eyes and ears in every corner, and the price for resistance was death. Yet Sophie pressed forward, her conscience demanding action where fear would have demanded silence. Alongside her brother Hans and fellow students Christoph Probst and Alexander Schmorl, Sophie intensified the efforts of the White Rose. Leaflets, meticulously composed, carefully printed, and discreetly distributed, became their voice. Each page carried words that pierced through propaganda, challenging citizens to think, to question, to act. The words were simple, yet powerful, truth over obedience, conscience over fear, courage over complacency. The nights were long and filled with peril. By candlelight, Sophie and her friends wrote and refined each leaflet. They debated wording, debated tone, debated whether their messages were strong enough to awaken a conscience asleep under tyranny. Paper rustled, ink dried, and the shadows of their small rooms seemed to lean closer, as if listening, judging, and testing their resolve. Distribution was its own act of courage. Leaving a leaflet under a classroom door, slipping one onto a stairwell railing, or tucking one into the pocket of an unsuspecting student carried immense risk. Each movement could be observed, each act could be reported. Yet Sophie and her friends persisted, fully aware that silence in the face of injustice was complicity. The cold streets of Munich became a stage for quiet rebellion. Sophie's heart raced with each step as she moved through darkened alleys and empty corridors. She thought constantly of the people who would read their words. Would anyone dare respond? Would anyone have the courage to act? The moral weight was heavy, yet it fueled her determination. The White Rose's philosophy was radical in its simplicity, appealed to reason and conscience. They wrote about the corruption of the Nazi regime, the destruction of moral values, the obliteration of truth, and the human cost of obedience. They called citizens to awaken, to resist silently but decisively, to uphold the principles that the regime sought to erase. Sophie's writing carried a piercing clarity, born of careful thought and unwavering integrity. Even as they worked, Sophie never lost sight of the personal cost. She often reflected on her family, on her parents' teachings, and on the principles that had guided her since childhood. Fear was constant, but she transformed it into resolve. She understood that courage was not the absence of fear, but the choice to act in spite of it. The winter nights were punctuated by moments of quiet anxiety. Every knock on the door, every shadow at a window, every uniformed passerby stirred tension. Yet, the White Rose pressed on. Sophie's composure and clarity inspired her companions. She led not with arrogance, but with quiet moral authority. Her courage was infectious, her conscience unwavering. As 1942 turned into 1943, the White Rose's impact began to ripple through Munich. Leaflets circulated beyond university walls, reaching factories, neighborhoods, and even the hands of officers. Each leaflet was a spark, a small flame challenging the darkness. Sophie understood that they were few, but their ideas were powerful. Courage, once ignited, could not easily be extinguished. Yet the risks grew with every action. Nazi surveillance tightened, rumors of informants spread, and each movement carried the shadow of discovery. Sophie and her companions were acutely aware that one mistake could be fatal. And yet, she pressed forward, fueled by conviction, by principle, by the knowledge that silence was a betrayal of conscience. In quiet moments, Sophie reflected on the enormity of what they were doing. She thought of the millions who had surrendered their voices, of those who had been silenced by fear, of the cost of obedience without conscience. And she thought of the power of words, words that could awaken thought, ignite courage, and confront tyranny without a single bullet. Sophie Scholl was no longer just a student. She had become a symbol, quiet yet resolute, principled yet daring, brave yet human. Every leaflet she touched, every word she wrote, carried the weight of her conscience. She moved with purpose through the snow-dusted streets of Munich, a small figure in a vast city, yet a force that would challenge the might of one of history's most terrifying regimes. And so, winter passed. The city slept under the grip of fear and propaganda, unaware that courage walked its streets. Sophie Scholl, the girl who had learned the power of conscience in her youth, was now actively wielding it, quietly, carefully, dangerously. The stage was set for the next chapter, a chapter that would test every principle she had ever held, every lesson her family had taught, and every ounce of bravery she possessed. This was the beginning of the White Rose's true resistance. The battle would not be fought with guns, nor armies, nor violence. It would be fought with ideas, with words, with unwavering moral clarity. And Sophie Scholl, the quiet student with an indomitable conscience, was ready. Winter melted into early spring of 1943, but in Munich, the grip of fear had only tightened. For Sophie Scholl and the White Rose, the time for quiet reflection was over. Their words, once confined to small corners and secret hands, were now spreading. Every leaflet slipped into the world carried a challenge, a spark of conscience, and the potential for change, but also the looming shadow of danger. Sophie moved through the city with careful steps. The snow had receded, leaving streets wet and glistening under the morning sun. Each movement was calculated. Each glance over her shoulder was deliberate. The city seemed ordinary, yet it had become a landscape of peril. Nazi surveillance was everywhere, eyes watching, ears listening, and suspicion ready to strike. But Sophie's resolve was unwavering. Fear had no dominion over conscience. The White Rose expanded their efforts. Leaflets were placed in university halls, factories, and even public telephone booths. Each piece carried the same unflinching message: we will not be silent. They spoke of moral responsibility, of the cost of obedience without conscience, and of the imperative to think, act, and resist. Sophie's handwriting, meticulous and deliberate, became a symbol of integrity and courage. Hans, Christoph, and Alexander worked closely with her, coordinating the distribution with careful timing and strategic placement. Every act was a calculated risk. Every step could lead to capture. Yet Sophie felt the weight of duty heavier than the weight of fear. The safety of anonymity was tempting, but she knew moral courage demanded exposure, or at least the willingness to risk it. Sophie's days were filled with tension. In lecture halls, she observed classmates repeating propaganda like incantations, their eyes hollow, their conscience dormant. She felt a mixture of anger and sadness. Anger at the deceit imposed upon them, sadness at the loss of their moral freedom. These observations strengthened her determination. If no one else would speak, she would. If courage was rare, she would exemplify it. Each evening, under candlelight, Sophie reflected on the day's efforts. Writing, planning, distributing. These acts required meticulous attention. The White Rose's leaflets had to be persuasive, concise, and stirring. Every word mattered. Every sentence was a moral argument. Sophie read and reread drafts, questioning each phrase. Does it convey truth? Does it awaken conscience? Does it inspire courage? The city itself seemed to conspire against them. Every uniformed officer, every sudden knock, every shadow across a doorway reminded Sophie of the stakes. Yet in this tension, her moral clarity shone brightest. Fear became a compass, not a cage. Danger was not a deterrent. It was a measure of the importance of their mission. The White Rose's activities did not go unnoticed for long. Rumors began to circulate, students whispering about leaflets, neighbors noticing unusual movements, officials quietly noting suspicious behavior. Sophie understood that exposure was inevitable. The walls of secrecy were thin, and each act of courage carried the weight of potential sacrifice. Despite the risk, Sophie and her companions pressed forward. The city's streets became their stage. Alleyways, stairwells, classrooms, and public squares. Every corner held the possibility of awakening thought. Each leaflet placed was a small act of rebellion, a spark in a society smothered by fear. Sophie's heart pounded with anticipation, not for herself, but for those who might read their words and awaken to the truth. The White Rose's philosophy was simple yet radical. Speak truth, act with conscience, resist injustice. Sophie believed in the power of ideas over violence, of courage over intimidation, of conscience over obedience. Every small action, every whispered discussion, every carefully distributed leaflet was a defiance of tyranny. Sophie often considered the consequences. Capture could mean death, a fact that loomed over her with chilling clarity. Yet she reasoned that moral inaction was a greater crime than personal risk. The lessons of her parents, the discussions with her brother, and her own observations of the world coalesced into unwavering determination. Courage was not a gift, it was a choice. And Sophie had chosen. By mid-1943, the White Rose had achieved a quiet but growing influence. Their leaflets traveled beyond the university, reaching factories, neighborhoods, and even sympathetic officers. Sophie's words had weight. They carried conviction, clarity, and moral authority. The impact was subtle yet profound, awakening conscience, inspiring reflection, and instilling courage. Every action sharpened Sophie's resolve. Each risk, each moment of tension, was a reminder that courage was a living thing, nourished by principle and nurtured by conscience. The city of Munich, unaware, became a canvas upon which Sophie painted the possibility of moral resistance. And so, winter faded into spring, and Sophie Scholl's courage grew. The White Rose's activities expanded, their influence spreading quietly through the streets, their words challenging fear, complacency, and tyranny. Sophie was no longer merely a student. She was a symbol, young, principled, and unwavering. Every step she took, every leaflet placed, every whispered conversation carried the weight of conscience and the promise of change. The stage was set for the events that would define history. Sophie Scholl and the White Rose were ready to confront the greatest danger of their lives. And though they did not yet know it, every act of courage had set in motion a chain of events that would make their names immortal. As 1943 unfolded, the tension in Munich grew. The city, under the tightening grip of Nazi control, seemed ordinary to the untrained eye, yet shadows moved differently here. Every corner, every alley, every echo of a footstep carried the possibility of danger. For Sophie Scholl and the White Rose, the stakes had never been higher. Sophie, now 21, moved with a measured confidence that belied the storm within her heart. Each morning she walked the streets of Munich, carrying her conscience as both armor and compass. The leaflets, once simple messages of hope, had become powerful instruments of defiance. Every distribution carried risk, and every success fed their moral resolve. The White Rose intensified its activities. Leaflets were distributed in university halls, hospitals, factories, and neighborhoods. Sophie and her companions ensured their words reached as many people as possible, often risking exposure multiple times a day. They understood the power of their message. The awakening of conscience was the greatest threat to tyranny. Each leaflet demanded courage from its reader. Phrases were chosen meticulously to pierce fear, to ignite moral reflection, to challenge obedience. Sophie believed in the power of words, that truth, carefully expressed, could awaken even the most subdued conscience. The pressure on Sophie grew heavier. Gestapo agents patrolled, rumors of informants spread, and suspicion crept into every corner of the city. The White Rose's secrecy was critical. Every action required careful timing, stealth, and absolute trust among the members. One misstep could lead to capture or death. Despite the fear, Sophie remained steadfast. She often reflected on the lessons of her parents. Courage is not the absence of fear, but the choice to act despite it. Her brother Hans shared her resolve, and together they inspired the other members to continue distributing leaflets, refining their messages, and planning their next steps. As spring approached, the White Rose became bolder. Sophie participated in nighttime excursions, slipping leaflets into classrooms and public spaces, moving like a shadow through the city. Each mission carried immense risk, yet every act strengthened her conviction. She was not acting for fame or glory. She was acting because it was morally right. Sophie's inner thoughts often returned to the weight of responsibility. She understood that their leaflets might not save lives immediately, that the majority of people might ignore them, or worse, betray them. Yet, she remained resolute. Moral action is never guaranteed to succeed, but it is always necessary. The White Roses leaflets reached a wider audience than they had imagined. Some students quietly discussed the ideas, some factory workers whispered to colleagues, and occasionally, sympathetic voices expressed gratitude. Sophie recognized that even small acts of reflection could ripple outward, creating a chain of conscience that the regime could not fully suppress. Yet danger was ever present. Gestapo scrutiny intensified. Each distribution required extreme caution, timing, disguise, and rapid movement. Sophie felt the tension keenly, aware that any miscalculation could lead to catastrophic consequences. In these months, Sophie's moral clarity deepened. She considered the nature of courage, the responsibility of conscience, and the fleeting nature of life. Every decision carried weight. Every choice was a testament to her principles. She wrote often, reflecting in private journals, pondering the moral questions that would define her legacy. By mid-1943, the White Roses' influence had become unmistakable. Their leaflets circulated widely, and whispers of their existence reached the ears of Nazi officials. Sophie, Hans, Christoph, and Alexander knew that the risk of discovery was imminent. Yet, they did not falter. Courage, they understood, is measured not by safety, but by adherence to principle in the face of danger. The city of Munich, unknowingly, had become the stage for acts of extraordinary bravery. Sophie Scholl, once a quiet student with a keen conscience, had transformed into a beacon of moral courage. Every leaflet placed, every message written, every risk taken was an assertion that conscience and truth mattered more than fear. The White Roses' activities in early 1943 were a delicate dance with fate. Each action could have been their last, yet Sophie and her companions continued with determination, guided by principle and the knowledge that their moral duty outweighed personal safety. Courage, Sophie realized, is not always loud. Sometimes it is quiet, measured, deliberate, and deadly effective in its subtlety. And so, as spring approached, the White Roses' resolve remained unbroken. Sophie Scholl's courage burned quietly yet fiercely, lighting the way for those willing to awaken to truth, to defy tyranny, and to act with conscience. The city may have appeared ordinary, but within it, courage walked boldly, carried by the hand of a young woman whose voice, though quiet, would soon resonate through history. The stage was set. Danger lurked closer than ever, and the choices made in the coming days would test Sophie Scholl's resolve in ways she had never imagined. Yet, one truth remained. Courage is a choice, conscience is a weapon, and Sophie Scholl had chosen both. February 1943. Munich lay quiet beneath a gray winter sky, but the city's silence was deceptive. The pulse of fear ran beneath every street, every building, every whispered word. Sophie Scholl, 21, moved with purpose, carrying not only leaflets but the weight of conscience. Each step could be her last, yet courage guided her forward. The White Rose had grown bolder. Their leaflets, now more urgent and compelling, were distributed with meticulous care. Each word was chosen to awaken thought, inspire moral reflection, and challenge obedience. Sophie understood the stakes. The Gestapo watched, suspicion was high, and a single misstep could end everything. Yet fear had no power over her resolve. Sophie's final mission began in the quiet hours of the morning. Together with her brother Hans, she carried bundles of leaflets into the university. Every movement was deliberate, every glance cautious. They knew the consequences of discovery: imprisonment, torture, execution. And yet, the moral imperative outweighed all else. The corridors of the University of Munich seemed ordinary, yet danger lingered in every shadow. Sophie's heartbeat echoed with a mixture of fear and determination. Her mind raced with reflection. The principles she had learned from her parents, the moral debates with Hans, the countless acts of quiet defiance that had brought them here. Every step was guided by conscience, every breath a measure of courage. In classrooms and stairwells, the White Rose's leaflets were carefully placed. Each bundle was distributed swiftly, silently, and methodically. Sophie's hands trembled only slightly, not from fear, but from the magnitude of the responsibility she bore. These leaflets were not mere paper. They were truth, conscience, and moral defiance incarnate. As the morning wore on, Sophie and Hans continued their work, moving with precision. Their actions were a dance with fate, every movement a calculated risk. And yet, in the midst of danger, Sophie remained composed. She understood that courage was not reckless. It was deliberate, disciplined, and unwavering. The distribution continued, reaching every corner of the university, lecture halls, stairwells, and even the administration offices. Sophie reflected on the power of ideas, the fragility of fear, and the importance of conscience. She thought of the millions who had surrendered their voices, the countless lives muted by obedience, and the profound necessity of speaking truth, even in the face of death. By mid-morning, their mission approached its climax. Sophie paused, glancing over the stacks of leaflets they had placed. Her mind was focused, her heart steady. The city around her seemed unaware, yet Sophie knew that the Gestapo's attention was growing. Each passing minute was a test of courage, a measure of conscience, and a preparation for the inevitable confrontation. As they moved through the university halls one final time, Sophie's thoughts drifted to the lessons of her parents, the guidance of her brother Hans, and the quiet determination that had carried her through countless acts of defiance. She felt the weight of history pressing down, yet her resolve remained unshaken. Courage, she knew, was not the absence of fear. It was the deliberate choice to act despite it. By late morning, the final leaflets had been distributed. Sophie and Hans paused briefly, exchanging a glance that conveyed both determination and awareness of the dangers surrounding them. The city seemed still, but the stage was set. The moment of reckoning was imminent, and the courage that had carried Sophie through countless challenges would soon be tested in ways she had never imagined. This was the culmination of months of quiet resistance. Every step, every conversation, every carefully placed leaflet had led to this day. Sophie Scholl, the girl who had learned the power of conscience in her youth, now stood on the threshold of history, ready to confront a regime that demanded obedience at the cost of morality. The world would soon bear witness to the courage of Sophie Scholl, and though danger was near, her voice, carried through words, ideas, and conscience, would echo far beyond the walls of the University of Munich. February 18, 1943. The University of Munich bustled with students, unaware of the storm about to break within its walls. Sophie Scholl, carrying her conscience as always, moved with deliberate care. Her brother Hans was at her side, the weight of months of defiance resting heavily upon them. Each step carried both purpose and peril, a quiet dance with fate that neither could avoid. As they ascended the grand stairwell, distributing leaflets one last time, Sophie's mind remained sharp, alert to every sound, every shadow, every possibility. The city outside seemed ordinary, but within the walls, danger was imminent. Gestapo agents, ever watchful, had begun to trace the subtle trail left by the White Rose. Every move was a calculated risk, every breath a test of courage. Then, in an instant, everything changed. A sudden presence, sharp, commanding, froze Sophie in place. Gestapo officers had arrived, surrounding her and Hans. The weight of inevitability pressed down, but Sophie's expression remained calm, her resolve unbroken. There was no panic, no hesitation. The moment demanded courage, and she met it with measured composure. The officers seized the leaflets, the evidence of months of quiet defiance. Sophie's heart pounded, yet her mind remained clear. She understood the consequences: interrogation, imprisonment, possibly death. And yet, she had no regrets. The moral imperative had guided her every action, and she knew that conscience could not be silenced by fear. Sophie and Hans were escorted through the university corridors, the weight of their arrest heavy in the air. Students watched in stunned silence, some frozen in fear, others in awe. Sophie's calm defiance became evident in every measured step, every composed glance. She faced the officers with a clarity that spoke louder than words, a testament to the courage that had defined her life. The Gestapo took them to a nearby office, the walls cold and imposing. Sophie's thoughts raced, yet she maintained control. Fear was present, but it did not dictate her actions. She reflected on her family, the lessons of her parents, and the countless hours of preparation that had led her to this moment. Conscience, she realized, demanded honesty, courage, and clarity, even under threat of death. Interrogation began. Officers sought to intimidate, to coerce, to extract confessions. They questioned motives, associations, and the origins of the leaflets. Sophie responded with calm precision, refusing to betray her friends or compromise the moral integrity of the White Rose. Each answer was deliberate, measured, and guided by principle. She understood that truth was her weapon and courage her shield. Even under intense scrutiny, Sophie's inner reflections were unwavering. She considered the nature of fear, the responsibility of conscience, and the importance of moral action. She understood that the Gestapo could control her body, but not her spirit. Each question, each threat, only reinforced her resolve. Courage is choice, truth is power, and conscience is invincible when faithfully upheld. Hours passed, yet Sophie's composure remained intact. She observed the officers, noting their attempts at intimidation, their reliance on fear, and their misunderstanding of moral courage. She realized that true bravery is quiet, deliberate, and principled, not performative, not dependent on circumstance. In the cold, oppressive office, Sophie maintained clarity. Her thoughts returned to her parents' guidance, her brother's support, and the countless acts of conscience that had defined the White Rose. Every leaflet distributed, every word written, every risk taken, all of it led to this moment of unwavering integrity. As the day waned, the Gestapo finalized their interrogation. Sophie's courage remained unbroken, a quiet defiance that could not be measured by intimidation. She had acted in accordance with conscience, and in that, she was free, even as the walls of imprisonment closed around her. February 18, 1943, marked the beginning of the final chapter for Sophie Scholl. The arrest was not the end of her courage. It was the stage upon which her moral clarity would shine brightest. And though the shadow of danger loomed, Sophie's voice, carried through the words of the White Rose, would soon echo far beyond the walls of Munich. The stage was set for the trial. Sophie Scholl's courage, unwavering conscience, and moral clarity were about to confront one of the most ruthless regimes in history, and the world would bear witness to the extraordinary bravery of a young woman who chose conscience over fear. In the dimly lit room of the Gestapo headquarters, Sophie Scholl sat with quiet composure. The walls, cold and unyielding, seemed designed to intimidate. Officers moved with deliberate authority, their eyes sharp, their voices measured. Each question was a blade, honed to extract fear, confession, or betrayal. But Sophie's spirit remained unbroken, a beacon of calm in a room designed to terrify. The interrogation began with forceful questions designed to shake her confidence. Officers demanded names, associations, and motives. They leaned closer, their words sharp, their tone threatening. Yet Sophie responded with precision and clarity, never faltering. She understood that truth was her strongest weapon, and courage her most steadfast shield. Sophie's thoughts were focused, deliberate. She considered the moral responsibility she bore, not only for herself, but for her brother, her companions, and the countless lives touched by the white rose. Each answer, each gesture, each measured word was a reflection of her unwavering principle. Conscience cannot be coerced. Fear cannot dictate morality. The Gestapo attempted every tactic: intimidation, manipulation, threats of death. Yet Sophie remained composed. Her responses were honest, yet protective of others. She refused to betray her friends, understanding that loyalty and conscience were intertwined. Her courage was quiet, deliberate, and profoundly powerful. Sophie reflected inwardly as the interrogation continued. Fear was present, yes, but it was transformed into resolve. She thought of her parents' guidance, of her brother Hans, and of the countless acts of defiance that had brought them to this point. Courage, she realized, is not the absence of fear. It is the decision to act rightly in spite of it. Hours stretched long. Each question was an attempt to destabilize her. Each silence, a test of resolve. Yet Sophie's mind remained sharp. She weighed her answers, considered their implications, and maintained her integrity. The Gestapo's tactics were formidable, but they underestimated one fundamental truth. A conscience grounded in principle cannot be broken by fear. In the quiet moments, Sophie reflected on the power of her actions. Every leaflet distributed, every word written, every step taken through Munich's streets had been an act of moral courage. Now, faced with direct confrontation, she realized that true bravery is measured not by the absence of danger, but by steadfast adherence to conscience in the face of it. Sophie's calm defiance became increasingly apparent. The officer's intimidation held little sway over her spirit. Each measured response, each unwavering gaze, demonstrated a courage that transcended fear. She embodied the principle that truth and conscience are far stronger than coercion or terror. As the interrogation concluded, Sophie knew that the consequences of her actions were severe. The Gestapo had noted her composure, her moral clarity, and her refusal to yield. Yet she did not falter. Her courage, rooted in principle, remained unshaken. Even in the shadow of impending danger, Sophie Scholl's inner strength shone brightly. The trial awaited. Sophie's moral reasoning, her courage under pressure, and her steadfast conscience would soon be tested in the public eye. And though the walls of oppression closed in, her voice, carried through the actions and words of the White Rose, would continue to resonate far beyond the confines of that room. February 22, 1943. Sophie Scholl stood in the People's Court in Munich, facing Roland Freisler, a man whose reputation for cruelty was feared throughout Germany. The room was silent, the air heavy with expectation. The weight of history pressed down upon her young shoulders, yet her composure remained absolute. The charges were severe: treason, subversion, and distribution of anti-Nazi leaflets. The courtroom, designed to intimidate, seemed to Sophie merely a stage for truth. Every gaze from the judge, every murmur of the audience, every click of a pen was a test of her courage. Freisler attempted to provoke fear, shouting accusations, twisting words, seeking to break her spirit. Yet Sophie's responses were calm, precise, and unwavering. She spoke of conscience, moral duty, and the courage to act rightly. Each word cut through the atmosphere of intimidation, a quiet defiance that stunned those present. Her calm, measured tone conveyed more than words alone. It revealed a mind unyielding, a heart resolute, and a courage rooted in principle. She did not cower, she did not plead, she answered with clarity and dignity. The audience sensed the depth of her conviction. Every statement Sophie made reaffirmed the moral force behind the White Rose. She spoke of obedience without conscience as a betrayal, of silence in the face of evil as complicity. She reminded the court that courage is measured not by absence of danger, but by the choice to uphold truth despite it. The trial was brief. The verdict, death by guillotine, was pronounced swiftly. Yet Sophie's resolve did not waver. She faced the sentence with acceptance, her mind and heart at peace. Fear had no hold, because conscience had always been her guide. Even in the courtroom, Sophie's courage inspired those who witnessed it. She had become more than a student, more than a rebel. She was a symbol of moral clarity, a beacon for generations to come. Her words, her composure, her defiance in the face of tyranny would echo far beyond that room, beyond Munich, beyond the years of war itself. Sophie Scholl, in that small courtroom, had achieved something far greater than survival. She had affirmed the power of conscience, the necessity of courage, and the enduring strength of moral truth. Her legacy was secure, not through fear, but through the unwavering clarity of her actions. February 22, 1943. The hours before Sophie Scholl's execution were quiet, almost serene. In her cell, she moved with calm deliberation, aware of the inevitability ahead, yet at peace. The walls were cold, the air heavy, but her spirit remained unbroken. Sophie reflected on her life, her choices, and the path that had led her here. Every step, every act of conscience, every leaflet distributed was a deliberate choice, a refusal to surrender to fear, a refusal to betray truth. She thought of her family, her brother Hans, and the friends who had shared this journey. Their courage had strengthened hers. Their loyalty had fortified her resolve. Even in these final hours, Sophie's thoughts were clear and purposeful. She wrote notes, exchanged kind words with fellow prisoners, and maintained her composure. Fear had no dominion over her. Instead, she carried a quiet pride, the pride of having acted rightly, courageously, and morally, even when the world demanded otherwise. She reflected on the moral lessons she had learned, that courage is a choice, that conscience is inviolable, and that truth is the most potent weapon against tyranny. Sophie understood that life could be taken, but the integrity of one's conscience could never be destroyed. In these moments, Sophie's mind drifted to the broader impact of her actions. The leaflets, though simple, had carried ideas of conscience, justice, and courage to countless individuals. She hoped that these ideas would endure, inspiring others to resist injustice and act morally, even in the face of fear. Her final reflections were not of fear or regret, but of purpose fulfilled. She had lived according to principle, acted with courage, and remained steadfast in the face of tyranny. In this, she found peace. The calm before her execution was a testament to Sophie Scholl's moral clarity. She did not tremble. She did not falter. She embraced the inevitability of death with dignity and resolve, knowing that courage and conscience had guided every moment of her life. In the quiet of her final hours, Sophie became more than a student, more than a resistor. She became a symbol of courage, conscience, and moral clarity, a beacon for generations yet to come. And though the darkness of the world threatened her life, her spirit remained luminous, a testament to the enduring power of truth. The morning of February 22, 1943, arrived with a chilling clarity. Sophie Scholl, steadfast and composed, walked the short path from her cell to the execution chamber. The guards' footsteps echoed against the cold stone floors, but Sophie's heart was calm. She carried no regret, only the quiet certainty that she had acted rightly. Her brother Hans had already faced the same fate. Sophie's thoughts were with him, with her friends, and with the courage they had shared. Every leaflet distributed, every word written, every risk taken had led to this final moment. Yet she did not falter. Her face bore calm determination, her eyes clear and unwavering. In the execution chamber, the atmosphere was heavy with tension. Sophie approached with dignity. She did not plead, she did not cry. Her spirit, guided by conscience and principle, remained unbroken. Even in the shadow of death, she embodied courage, moral clarity, and the enduring power of truth. Sophie Scholl's final moments were quiet, measured, and profoundly human. She had faced the greatest fear with serenity, having chosen a life and a death guided by conscience. Her actions would resonate far beyond that chamber, inspiring countless others to act with courage and uphold moral truth in the face of tyranny. Though her life was extinguished, Sophie's legacy had only begun. The White Rose's words, carried by her courage, would echo through history, a reminder that even in the darkest times, conscience and courage endure. Though Sophie Scholl and her companions of the White Rose paid the ultimate price, their courage did not die with them. The leaflets they had distributed quietly spread, smuggled out of Munich, copied and circulated by those who had understood their message. Even under the harshest repression, the ideas they championed, conscience, moral courage, and truth, lived on. The execution of Sophie, Hans, and other members sent a chilling warning, yet it could not extinguish the light they had ignited. Students whispered their names, families told their stories, and the memory of their defiance grew stronger. Sophie Scholl became more than a girl in Munich. She became a symbol of resistance against oppression, a reminder that courage is possible even in the darkest times. Decades later, the story of the White Rose continues to inspire. Schools, memorials, and museums preserve their courage. Sophie's letters, diaries, and the leaflets themselves are studied as lessons in moral integrity. Young people learn that one voice, one conscience, can challenge injustice. Every act of moral courage, no matter how small, carries the potential to ripple through history. The White Rose showed that bravery is not always loud. It can be quiet, deliberate, and deeply principled. Sophie Scholl's life reminds us that courage is a choice, to speak, to act, to resist. Even in the face of overwhelming power, one can act with integrity, guided by conscience rather than fear. In reflecting on Sophie's story, we see the human capacity for bravery and moral clarity. She teaches us that the cost of silence in the face of injustice is far greater than the cost of action. Through her, we understand that the truest form of strength is ethical courage, the willingness to do what is right, regardless of consequence. The White Rose's legacy is a testament to the enduring power of ideas. Even under regimes built on fear, oppression, and violence, conscience can prevail. Sophie Scholl's life, brief though it was, became a lighthouse for all who value freedom, truth, and justice. Her courage resonates across generations, reminding us that moral integrity is never outdated, and that standing for truth is always worth the risk. As we remember Sophie Scholl, we honor every act of quiet resistance, every moral choice made in defiance of oppression, and every voice that refuses to be silenced. Her story, and the story of the White Rose, reminds us that courage is contagious, that conscience is powerful, and that even a single individual can inspire change that echoes far beyond their time. Sophie Scholl's journey, from a young student questioning the world around her, to a symbol of courage and conscience, teaches us that bravery is not the absence of fear, but the choice to act rightly despite it. The White Rose may have been small, but their impact is monumental. In every whisper of truth, in every act of moral courage, in every voice that refuses to obey injustice blindly, Sophie Scholl lives on. Her story is not only history, it is a guide. It calls us to awaken our own conscience, to act with courage, and to recognize that even in a world overshadowed by fear, integrity can shine brilliantly. Sophie's legacy is eternal, a reminder that courage, truth, and conscience are the most powerful forces against tyranny.